Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements. And here we are talking about an article published in the Brooklyn Rail, which is effectively a review of Vincent Bevin's If We Burn, Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution. I've spoken a lot about Bevins and I have some criticisms of the same book. So when I saw that Jasper Bernes had written on it, I wanted to cover it. Jasper Bernes is an interesting figure in some ways. A person who I've engaged with, a poet and a scholar of Marxist history and labor theory of value. He's in the UC system and often at Stanford. His scholarly book that I most am familiar of is The Work of Art in the Age of Deindustrialization from 2017, as well as You Are Nothing, We Are Nothing, and So Can You. He was involved in EndNotes and has published at Brooklyn Rail, Lana Turner, Modern Language Quarterly, Critical Inquiry, all the places you'd expect him to do. And he edits Commune Editions with Juliana Spar and Joshua Clover. Clover is a theorist that I have a lot of ire for, actually, but nonetheless. He lives in Berkeley. I know him from his days around the New York left communist scene and communization theory, and from arguing with him on Facebook a decade ago. So that's my history with Jasper Bernes. Not a ton. I wouldn't say we know each other very well. We are in each other's spheres. I'm a poet. He's a poet. I'm a communist theorist. He's a communization theorist. But that's probably as far as the likenesses go. But we both had issues with Vincent Bevin's book. I want to go into it a little bit. So let's start here with this article from Brooklyn Wow. And like normal, I'm going to make this a little bigger for the visually impaired. And this, I don't see, this is very recent, so it's from this year. What Was to Be Done? Protest and Revolution in the 2010s by Jasper Bernes. Start off with the image of Tahrir Square on January 29th, 2011, on the Friday of Unity, which was later mockingly dubbed Kandahar Friday, due to the Islamists coalesced in Tahrir and the Islamists chanting Islamia, Islamia in 2011. Photo Ahmad Abu al-Fatah. Organized for Success. The key point of Vincent Bevin's must discuss If We Burn, the Mass Protest Decade in the Missing Revolution, Public Affairs 2023. Before you begin, examine what it would take for you to win not just the first battle, but the next one and the one after that. What will happen and who will do it? In Egypt's Tahrir Square and Ukraine's Maidan Plaza, Bevin tells us, protesters found themselves blinded by the light of their own unexpected success, unable to shape the vast forces unleashed. But Bevins argues that these groups were not just unable to organize, but unwilling to do so, committed to a hegemonic ideology, horizontalism, that forswore explicit designated leadership. It's hard to believe that it was, this is where I'm talking, it's hard to believe that was ever hegemonic. It might be hegemonic in university discourse, but my knowledge of even Tahrir Square, that was not the case. Those protesters therefore opened up a power vacuum they were unwilling to fill. As a result, their movement were often recuperated by conservative nationalist and fascist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or the right sector in Ukraine, who lacked such scruples and were much more happy to negotiate on behalf of the movement. The main characters in his narrative return in the penultimate chapter to reflect on this oversight and his narrative and reflect on this oversight and its consequences. Long quote. Mahmoud Salam, the blogger who had crossed the Nile to fight for Tahrir Square in 2011, recalls the final battle scene from the movie trilogy The Lord of the Rings, where Sauron is defeated. What did they think? That if Mubarak fell, all evil would simply disappear from the land? When Lucas Vegetable Montero told me that the Movimento Passe Libre, that's Portuguese, so I'm probably mispronouncing it too much like Spanish, had made no preparation for what happened after the successfully killed the Fair Hike, He smiled and burst into humble laughter. They had forgotten quite a big detail. Theo, a young Hong Konger who fought alongside the Braves in 2019, looks back wistfully on the approach they took in the second half of the year. They certainly weren't going to beat Beijing in an open confrontation, so what was the end game? History does not possess a supernatural metaphysical quality that pushes it forward relentlessly. Many people in my generation, and I think I too was guilty of this teleological mode of thought at the beginning of the decade, think that if you simply give the thing a kick, it would come unstuck and move in the right direction. Asterisk. There is no right direction. There's only a direction you can make it move. Paradoxically, liberals, socialists, conservatives, and anarchists alike have all thought that way, even as they define the right direction rather differently. But if you burn down your building, diving Providence does not supply you with a better one. If you chop down a tree, you do not immediately get a bigger tree. Sometimes you are just left with a stump. Industrial society becomes ever more complex. We'll come back to complexity in another post. The range of possible human unintended consequences grows larger. And if your car isn't running well, it is not recommended to light it on fire and hope that a better one comes along. I quote this long passage not because it is one of the few direct statements of the book's conclusion, but also because it gives the reader a sense of the book's omniscient narrative style. Who is the they referred to in Mahmoud Salam's question? Is it really the millions in the streets that they thought? Bevins uses what is called free indirect style, in which an omniscient narrator voices the thought or speech of characters directly. Yeah, we see this invented in fiction, mostly around Jane Austen, actually, without attribution. Yeah, and that's a very dangerous thing to do in creative nonfiction. This is where Bernes's training as a literary critic actually matters for these people who are making journalism, because journalists use literary techniques often to hide parts of the story. I'm not accusing it deliberately. You can do it by accident all the time, and Bevins probably did do it by accident, but nonetheless, Bernes has a point here. But this can make it difficult to know who is thinking or speaking. Salam, everyone in the streets, Bevins. The collective confession linking Mahmoud in Egypt, Montero in Brazil, and Theo in Hong Kong to a generational ideology Bevins formally shares allows him to conclude the paragraph with a philosophy of history and a few aphorisms which are clearly his and his alone, but now ascribed to these movements in their entirety. What's more, it turns out that everyone, liberals, socialists, conservatives, and anarchists, subscribe to the vulgar philosophy of just give it a big kick. Does everyone really believe such a thing? And the answer, of course, and this is Varn talking, is no. This narrative fog is in a sense the result of not just a style, but of a method. As Bevins notes in his introduction, If We Burn is not a work of history. No, it's really not. Comparative sociology or political theory, much less a militant assessment of the cycle of struggle circa 2011. It's a journalistic narrative of the mass protest decade based on hundreds of interviews conducted in a dozen countries. To tell the story of these mass protests through the experience of its participants, Bevins would ask the interviewees almost intentionally stupid questions. What led to the protest explosion? What were its goals? Were they achieved? If they weren't achieved, why not? To uncover the missing revolution and provoke the kinds of reflections synthesized in the paragraph above, he would ask, quote, something like, what would you tell a teenager in Tanzania or Mexico or Kyrgyzstan who may live through a political explosion or might attempt to change life in her country? What lessons would you draw from your own experiences and impart to them? The answers are quite fascinating, and one can learn much about how the uprisings unfold from If We Burn. But Bevin's journalistic approach can lead us to attribute the effects of the uprisings directly to the ideas of their participants. Yeah, and this would be idealism, by the way. And particularly participants who are central to organizing what initiated things. But in mass action, effects are not the results of individual intention. First, because people act together and therefore effects are extra individual. And second, because they act in conflict with reactive and sometimes proactive forces. In mass action, events occur which no one quite intended. This requires analysis to attend as much as to what people did as what they thought. Take the book's discussion of Tahrir, for example. Bevins interviewed many of the key players who kicked off the occupation of Tahrir in the so-called Egyptian Revolution, and his account contains useful information about the planning, intention, and choice that underlies any so-called spontaneous uprisings. Inspired by the Tunisian Revolution, and anti-regime and anti-police activists called for protests on January 25th, National Police Day, whose size and ferocity surprised them. Protesters managed to make it to Tahrir Square, which they had not expected. Hoping to extend this energy, they called for another protest on January 28th after Friday prayers. This was the climactic days of rage, in which, in addition to seizing and occupying Tahrir Square for duration, participants burned down over 90 police stations. This is no longer a protest, but a revolution, require a shift in tactics and strategy among the organizers of the January 22nd Day of Action. Bevins describes the Day of Rage as an opportunity missed. Quote, a wave of Egyptians battled the cops on Qasr al-Nil Bridge, been there, holding their ground while suspended over the Nile, pushing back, taking losses, and then advancing again until the police simply retreated. At this point, the revolutionaries could have taken anything. Could they have? They chose to stay in Tahrir Square, the default destination for the crowd. It was an empty piece of land, and its contrast offered no strategic value. This is not exactly true. Though uniformed police had collapsed, the army remained in the streets, having secured key sites such as the presidential palace, the Ministry of the Interior, and the Maspero television building beforehand. Yeah, I thought so too. For those of you who don't know or are new to the channel, I was in Egypt in the counter-revolution consolidation in 2015 to 17. So I heard many different things than what Bevins presents in that book. Participants did in fact go to strategic sites, but the superficial analysis could tell them that their options were to violently attack the army, which they would lose, to attempt to win them over, sowing division amongst the rank. The unfortunate slogan of the movement then, the people in the army are one hand, indicated both a hope that the army or some part of it would side with the revolution, but also a tacit admission that the army would safeguard any process of transition and violently repress any revolution that aimed to disempower it, unless the revolutionaries were to render it inoperable. At this moment, Hosni Mubarak had not yet stepped down and still had control over state television, radio, and newspapers, which continued their propagandistic state-directed coverage, not to mention the secret police, who were still arresting, abducting, and in some case killing protesters. Bevins therefore narrates a free, unmotivated choice of what is in fact quite constrained. He sees a power vacuum as a pure space of possibility, what is in fact not a vacuum at all, but rather a decrease in the pressure of power. Given the size of the crowds and the army control of key sites, the choice was to stay in Tahrir or disperse, and staying in the plaza had obvious benefits. It paralyzed the city and created the central hub for organizing and the relay of information. Especially important, most Mubarak shut down parts of the internet. Yeah, shutting down parts of the internet happened all the time even when I was in Egypt. Nonetheless, Bevins is right to ask why this near revolution and others failed. What could have been done, if anything? It is this, if anything, clause which falls out of the picture with Bevin's psychologizing approach. And asterisk, a lot of people, particularly people who are obsessed with like verticalist strategies, tend to do this. They tend to think this is about ideology and ideological visions, and it often isn't. All right. At that point, all their materialism goes away because they want to blame a person or an idea and not facts on the ground. Was the outcome of the Egyptian Revolution really a pursuit of bad strategy or ideology? If so, it behooves Bevins to be clear about what could have been done from that point or earlier. What could have succeeded, and here his book is frustratingly vague. He makes the most basic error that any book which offers a periodizing or historicizing claim can make. He defines a new era of mass protest and missing revolution without defining it in relation to whatever area preceded it. And this is what I was talking about when I critiqued it indirectly when I was talking about the Alex Chile article on the millennial left. Is that it seemed to miss the prior history And Bevins isn't a historian, he admits that, but you can't put this stuff in context with journalistic presentism and then like make historiographic claims, which Bevin does do. All right. As such, it is only half periodization, and much of what Bevins describes to the mass protest decade is hardly specific. Sorry. It's hardly specific to the 21st, or in some cases to the 20th, the 21st century, or in some cases to the 20th. Revolutions almost always take revolutionaries by surprise. That was true in the Bolshevik Revolution too, by the way. And few of them result directly from plans laid out in advance. The dynamic he describes, where protests against this or that injustice became revolutions, usually after some moment of violent repression by the state, is not at all new. It is apparent in many of the most famous and studied revolutions of the 19th and 20th century. This is just how revolutions start. This lack of full periodization also leaves us without any concept of success, since the error can only show us what's missing. This half periodization produces half concept of revolution. What success would have looked like here? What does a revolutionary success look like in general? Aside from vague gestures to the Russian Revolution, Bevins does not say. This leads one to wonder how much of the dynamic he describes is really attributable to the mass protest decade. One can imagine similar sets of claims for other decades, particularly the 60s. But even in the world revolution of 1917 and 1923 might ultimately be described as an era of mass action and missing revolution. After all, the revolutions only happened in the places they weren't supposed to. That's Varn adding that. Bevins finds one exception to the role of leadership forsworn in the 1919-1920 triennial social explosion, Estado Social. As happened also in Brazil, this was a protest over the price of transit that became a general uprising with a welter of concerns and demands. And like Brazil, Chile featured a strong institutional left with its basis in social movements. Figures like Gabriel Boric and Camila Vallejo emerged in the 2011 student movement and entered Congress. But unlike Brazil, there was a right-wing president and therefore no concern from left-wing groups about upsetting their paymasters. We have to remember that in 2011, Lula was in charge of Brazil. Anyway, it's very similar to Brazil was closer to Occupy and Obama than many people want to look at, particularly since the same people who were often boosters of Occupy are boosters of Lula now. The uprising managed to extend itself and deepen, paralyzing Chilean capital for months. Fearing a violent massacre, Boric collaborated with liberals and centrists within the government to broker a deal for a new constitutional reform convention. Though a majority of the movement rejected this plan, Boric managed to build a successful presidential bid around a constitutional reform campaign, which eventually gathering support from within the movement. For Bevins, this was not a recuperation so much as good fortune. Quote, Chile was lucky enough that it ultimately had its meaning imposed on it by a generation that understood the streets, had entered power at an earlier moment in the decade of interconnected struggles, and had actually had legitimacy to pull something off. Nonetheless, the constitutional amendment failed radically and badly, raising the question of whether or not it was the right strategy. As Bevins notes, Boric has yet to deliver a substantial result beyond winning the presidency, much less to say a revolution. Is Boric's claiming of the mantle of Estado Social, rejected by much of the movement, really different from the Mother Brotherhoods in Egypt or the Ukrainian right of Maidan? What would count as success for participants of these movements for Bevin are for readers of this review. If the revolution was missing during these decades, what does a revolution look like? Another problem is that Boric's exception proves the rule is really no exception at all, and emerges only from the choice by Bevins to exclude movements from Europe, such as Syntagma Square, occupation of Greece, and the 15M movement in Spain, both of which did feature mass parties firmly rooted in the movements, Syriza and Podemos, respectively. In Greece, Syriza controlled the government briefly, but was forced to prosecute austerity it earlier railed against by virtue of its position as a debtor nation within the EU's economic and monetary union. Like the constitutional reform campaign in Chile, the Greek secrets featured a disastrous referendum campaign led by Syriza that ended up in failure and led ultimately to the collapse of the party and the return of the right. The result that Podemos had gleaned in Spain had also been meager and certainly not revolutionary. This path not only seems unexceptional, but also unpromising. Bevins excludes these cases and focuses on the movement outside of Europe and the US because he wants to tell the story of how an ideology developed in the 1960s in the United States in particular, and in the traditional First World in general, horizontalism, has shaped the tactical toolkit and strategic horizons of the movements around the globe. There is a kernel of truth to this account, in so much as social movements today do live in the shadow of the long 1968, whose logic and repartee have not been overcome. But this is, in my view, and the view of many others, less a result of ideology than the long-term structural changes in capitalism, which is now global. In any case, 1968, which was as much a global event inspired by revolutionary developments in Cuba and China and Algeria, as it was a Euro-American one, and the vectors of the influence do not always move from the center to periphery, as the influence of figures such as Mao, Che Guevara, and Frantz Fanon made clear. For the US, the civil rights struggle, urban riots, and Black Power were as powerful, if not more powerful, examples than the student movements. And though there was certainly a well-developed anarchist and ultra-left tendency within the Global 68, particularly in France and Italy, it was rarely dominant, and many of the groups and participants adopted a broad Marxist-Leninist that was quite verticalist. A broad Marxist-Leninism that was quite verticalist. Bevins focuses on the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society in the United States, but when the SDS broke apart, the two successor organizations, the RYM, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, and the PLPWSA, the Progressive Labor Party and Workers' Student Alliance, were both Marxist-Leninist cadre organizations, as was the rather underground, another SDS offshoot. Why then have the marginal anarchists and ultra-left ideas from 68 failed better? If we Byrne argues that the horizontalist ideology that permeated the media representations of protest was privileged the traditional First World. According to Bevins, it is not so much that the people in Turkey and in Brazil are explicitly influenced by horizontalist theory, but that they see it on television, Twitter, and in films, having been selected by Americans and others who privilege this type of action. He gives a few examples of what this means, and his interviewees aren't particularly clear either. Is it the Lord of the Rings or V for Vendetta horizontalist? Even if this were true, were the images of protest which his interviewees called to mind were determining what they would really do, really of Western in origin, or only the square and the plaza occupation is truly new to this sequence, and has its origins in protest marches to the city centers that are as old as the revolution itself? Everything else, barricades and street fighting, are constant elements of mass uprisings for as long as we have records. But if we're to look for origins of the plaza occupation, it lies, as Bevin acknowledges, in the 2001 Argentinizado in Argentina, and more proximately, the occupation of central Oaxaca City by the Popular Assembly of the Peoples of Oaxaca in 2006. Yeah, I've been there. That place is constantly being occupied. And of course, it must be noted that this tactic, which may have been discovered independently, like many scientific discoveries, spread from the Arab world to the West and not the other way around. Events in Argentina and Oaxaca did feature a strong emphasis on what the Argentinians called horizontalidad, influenced by anarchist and autonomous theory, some of it European and American in origin, but this can also be made into a product of the U.S. New Left by a very ham-fisted narrative. Anarchism has a long history in Argentina and Mexico, where it developed in directions distinctly opposed to the European and American variants, and took on particular characteristics of struggles of the 1960s and 70s against dictatorial governments. Mexico City, let's remember, a key site within the global 1968 movement, and an important source for the development of horizontalidad was the anti-globalization movement, highly visible within the Western media, but by no means a U.S. or European-led movement. Given the singular influence on it of the Zapatista uprising and its many participants from the global South, particularly in Latin America, the Brazilian Free Fair movement, Movimento Passa Libre, around which Bevin centers his narrative, were certainly influenced by these anti-globalization movements, but it is mistaken to identify these as emanating from the traditional First World, when a key site was, as Bevin acknowledges, the World Social Forum, founded in Porto Alegre in 2001. Which was intimately connected to the socialist movements in Latin America. Does it even make sense to talk of the traditional First World when it comes to protest movements in such a globalized world? Do the magnetic field lines really emanate from North America? Yeah, that feels like American exceptionalism to me. The Free Fair Movement, MPL, and the World Social Forum have roots within the far left Brazilian group stretching back to the 1960s, whose ideology cannot be easily rendered Western or First World. Is looking for the origins of the mass protest decade futile, given the tendency of particular situations to select for certain tactics? Whatever the case, in examining the mass protest decade, what we typically see are tactics moving from the periphery to the center and not the other way. After protesters in Hong Kong pioneered the use of lasers, umbrellas, and hard hats in their battles with the cops, so-called frontline tactics as tactical toolkit proliferated in Chile and was widely used in the U.S. George Floyd uprising. Now we see these same tactics clearly originating in Hong Kong within the University of Gaza Solidarity encampments. What is Western about this? The story of Euro-American horizontalism that we get in If We Burn reifies first world supremacy it aims to undermine, and they often do. It's funny how that works. Anyway, it overemphasizes the continuity between the anti-globalization movement and the mass protest decade. We need to distinguish between horizontalism, leaderlessness, and the embrace of spontaneity, planlessness. The mass protests of the anti-globalization movement were highly planned and coordinated, involving a systemic development of consistency between affinity groups, spokes councils, and other formulations necessary to field mass protest where so many participants travel for somewhere else. Yeah, I did that. I traveled from Macon, Georgia to Seattle when I was 18 years old to participate. It was a de-radicalizing experience for me, as I've said many times, but this is exactly what he's talking about. While things happened that were unplanned and participants acted autonomously, to call these events spontaneous is to miss their essential character. In the countries treated in If We Burn, however, the participants rarely organize in this highly formal manner, largely because it would have been impossible. Protesters in Tahrir Square could not make the decisions according to consensus, and most probably had never been introduced to such a concept. In any case, such organizing model is impossible with so many participants not already organized into affinity groups of a few people, each with designated delegates, a model of inclusive socialist organizing at least as old as the Paris Commune. Was spontaneity in these cases a choice, an ideology, or simply a structuring condition? The one exception to the spontaneism can be found in Brazil among the Free Fair movement, activists in Sao Paulo, whom Bevins places at the center of his narrative. These activists were avowed horizontalists and believed that theirs was a movement in which everyone is a leader, or where leaders do not exist. An idea, it must be said, with its origins in 19th century anarchism and not in 1968. But this did not mean an embrace of the informal or spontaneous. On the contrary, the consensus building model of organizing was highly formal. I often argue it's too formal. Anyway, that's just me. On the contrary, their consensus-based model of organizing was highly formal, as Bevin says in response to the proposed increase in the price of transit in Sao Paulo. Quote, they planned for the exact number of demonstrations they thought would be necessary for Mayor Ferdinando Haddad to give in. Though Bevins faults them for not designating a single person as a spokesperson, they do make unified decisions about how and with whom to communicate, quite different from the media free-for-all in other movements. Haddad's Workers' Party had a complex relationship with activist groups and NGOs, which it tried to transform into clients, a fate the MPL wanted to avoid by maintaining autonomy. A single spokesperson would have been a point of weakness, given the social entanglement of the Workers' Party with the far left. And remember, this was when the Workers' Party was in power, guys. At first, when Haddad's offices reaches out through mutual friend for dialogue, they refuse, but then do not speak to the press and go on TV. Their strategy involves calling for a series of explosive demos that blockade the streets, are engaged in mass turnstile jumping, fighting the police who try to stop them. This is Exhibit A for Bevins, who thinks that this is an example of breaking things and sees what happens protest philosophy of the decade, but this is a poorly chosen example, since the group was extremely meticulous in its planning and had a definite idea of how to win. They also did win, surprisingly, getting Haddad to back down after repeated intransience, even as the mayors in other cities canceled plans for fare increases. That they won is hardly remarked on by Bevins, even though it marks a signal difference from the other cases, all of which feature objectives which are either revolutionary or near revolutionary and not winnable like a fight against a fare increase. This is because Bevins is concerned with what unfolds after and as they win. The MPL staged a series of increasingly bold protests that managed to keep thousands in the streets and outwit police. But it appears as if, despite their well-laid plans, they were about to lose in the face of Haddads and transients until the Sao Paulo police made a misstep, attempting to clear the protesters at all costs and shooting many people, including journalists, in the face with rubber bullets. This induced a shift in the movement, causing it to grow from thousands to hundreds of thousands. With admirable foresight, the MPL activists immediately recognized the danger and the opportunity of this movement. Their force had been multiplied immensely, but their message had been risked being diluted if the protest became about police brutality in general. They held a press conference and also indicated their willingness to negotiate with the mayor. Although they were at first rebuffed, they held on as the protests were more violent, but also more intractable, swelling with a welter of incoherent demands. They managed to cash out and get the fare increase canceled. On balance, they did pretty well by their own standards. They even won the day that they had predicted, something that, as far as activist campaigns go, is pretty much a hole in one. Lucas Montero, one of the MPL activists who's coursed through the movement Bevin traces, says he wishes they had planned for what to do after they'd won the repeal of the fare increases. Though they had hoped their victory would inspire others to direct action in general, they didn't plan to lead those actions except perhaps in so much as they pertain to their ultimate goal, free transit. What is remarkable about the situation for Bevins is not that they only achieved specific victory by inspiring popular uprisings that they could not control, but because it had become about more than transit, about austerity and social welfare, but also about corruption and police violence. Groups critical of President Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party from the left, accusing it of abandoning its social policies, but uneasily with criticisms from the right, who accused the Workers' Party correctly of corruption and cronyism. Yeah, I've never seen that. Like, social democrats who used to tell me that we should take Dilma Rousseff seriously had always made me kind of laugh. Increasingly, the protests took on a patriotic character that cloaked itself as anti-politics, or in anti-politics. We see this all the time, too. Fake anti-politics is a rule of the day. Wrapped in Brazilian flags, some attendees would beat up anyone who identified with a political party. Nonetheless, needless to say, in order to intervene in such chaos, the MPL would have needed an entirely different group with more general aims and with much more general program. And yet, it's not clear that they could have kicked things off on such terms. In any case, what needs to be pointed out is that their ideology was hardly spontaneous, even if it was horizontalist. Their problem was not their disorganization or informality, but their inflexibility and highly formal nature. As Bevins points out, their insistence on consensus made it impossible to admit new members who wanted to join and who joined the protest in order to help it win its demands. And while a democratic centralist majority rule Leninist organization might have felt slightly better, it would still find it impossible to integrate such members within a narrow time frame in which the movement shifted character. And there are plenty of examples of revolutions where former parties with majority rule principles failed to integrate participants in mass action until long after the fact. Tons of them. I can think of tons. This is why Trotsky and Lenin recognized the centrality of extra party formations, such as workers' councils, even if they ultimately aim to dominate them with their parties. Informal self-organizations with its multiplicative 2 by 2, whereas formal organizations are additive 1 by 1, and therefore formal organizations always tail mass actions and revolutionary sequences and succeed only by playing catch-up. That's actually a good point. What should the MPL have done? If there's anything to be done, as Bevins notes, quote, someone must represent the group causing the problems and negotiate victories. But which victories? The MPL did negotiate the victory, but failed to transform into a group that could lead or direct protests after they had become more general in their demands. But what victories could have been negotiated in this later point? Here we see the issue which Bevins focus on militants who he deems in every instance protesters in the book defined by a missing revolution. If these are protesters, then who is a revolutionary? How does one negotiate a revolution? Perhaps the MPL could have constituted themselves as the free fare or right to the city party, gone to meet with Rousseff and Haddad, demanded free fares and other social welfare programs connected to the right to the city. To do so, however, they would have been willing. Would have to be willing and able to negotiate on behalf of the movement. And as Bevins notes, the question is whether people give such a minority the right to speak for them. And as such, the problem doesn't lie within the leadership, but within the movements themselves. Leading such events is easier said than done, and a look at revolutionary history, as well as examples on hand from the mass protest decade, indicates that such leadership is often rejected by the revolution itself. Parties like disciplinary or policing power and such cannot force their members to agree with leadership. All they can do is expel or ignore them. Bevins is unaccountably sanguine about such negotiating or mediating parties, ignoring the paltry results of Boric. Yeah, that's a big flaw in that book. Podemos and Syriza. The problem lies in his unwillingness to consider the problem of the state and state power. Imagine that the MPL had prepared itself for this generalization of the struggle and began negotiating with the Workers' Party and the Brazilian state. They would need to demonstrate their capacity to lead by their willingness to call off protest in exchange for concessions. But what concessions could they win, which would lead to people leaving the streets? Would they be able to call off the riots? Any gains they won at such a preliminary point, where the power of the state had not been threatened, would be too meager for those out in the streets who were calling for wholesale change in Brazilian society. In order to clarify and sharpen the revolutionary aspirations in order to gain the trust of the people, but such demands can never be negotiated short of a complete economic and political collapse. In fact, it's not clear that the goal of the leadership at such a preliminary moment should be to negotiate when the disruption cost of Brazilian society was so minimal. What would it take to win free fares in a free city, not to mention a revolution? Much more force than Brazilians had already bought. As such, any leadership does not extend, intensify, and spread the disruption is not likely to be able to win anything significant. Bevins laments the issueless destruction of mass protest decade, which has little to show for itself except burned police stations, barricades, and riots, and yet as far as revolutions go, these events are not destructive enough. Only in Egypt was the reproduction of society threatened, and there only threatened, not actualized. Perhaps what these movements needed was less the ability to negotiate with the powers that be than to deepen, extend, and endure. This is also a matter of organization, but of organization internal to the movement. Think about the movement during the Egyptian Revolution discussed above. Street policing had collapsed, but the army had backstopped the state and its media guarding key sites. What could a negotiating party have achieved at this moment, and what would have satisfied the desires of its participants? What leadership might have the movement have followed? The passphrase of the movement was, the people want the fall of the regime, but such a thing was not negotiable by the movement from the position of comparative weakness. The power base within the army and the state was certainly willing to depose Mubarak, but not to depose themselves. Yeah, we very much saw that. That's why Fatah came back. Or not Fatah, Al-Sisi. Sorry. Mubarak dies in the prison, Torah prison across the street from me. All right. When I lived there in Maadi. The task at this point was then not to mediate the movement, but to extend, intensify, and amplify it, and weakening the regime's grips of power. As theorists of revolution since Marx have recognized, the first task of revolution is the destruction of the standing army and its replacement by armed people. This process that rarely happens all at once, but in the depth of a revolution can be in part be measured by the degree to which a state monopoly and violence has been annulled and its laws are no longer applicable. In Egypt, the street police had collapsed, but not the army. The biggest obstacle to such a development was not the movement's horizontalism or spontaneism, but its populism. As they confronted the army guarding the presidential palace, protesters chanted, "The people and the army are one hand." As noted above, this represented both an inverted wish for the armed people and an accession of power of the army to safeguard the transition of power and to contain a continuity of the regime. None of this is to say that these movements could have succeeded as they were, nor to deny that these movements would have to adopt new forms of organization if they were to succeed in becoming revolutionary. But these organizational tasks were less about representing the movement to power than about representing the movement to itself, allowing for coordinated action. As Bevins notes, leadership is meaningless if no one will follow. Excuse me. As Bevins notes, leadership is meaningless as no one will follow. It is also meaningless if it doesn't deepen and extend the revolution rather than trading for peanuts. These would need to be organizations not just for, but of and by the vast majority committed to revolutionary transformation of society. The purpose would be the amplification and coordination of revolutionary action, the expanded reproduction of revolution through revolutionary measures. These would not be simply deliberating bodies, but working organizations feeding, housing, caring for people, and organizing revolutionary defense. We can see a glimpse of such ruptures within the mass protest decade. A month after the January 28th Day of Rage, protesters or revolutionaries trying to break into the Ministry of Interior building in Cairo were rebuffed by the State Security Investigation Services, the SSI, and the Army. In Alexandria, masses of people were surrounded the SSI's building there, where it was rumored the officers were destroying evidence of their crimes. But the SSI officers violently attacked the protesters, instigating a violent 3-day battle in which the protesters stormed the building, removing the masses of documents from the building. Most of these were handed over to the Army, however, rather than shared with the public. Elsewhere, protesters marched on the SSI buildings, but this time the Army evacuated them, securing the documents. In these events, one can see a partial suspension of state power, but one that reveals the limits that remained. Perhaps the revolutionary organization could have taken over the securing of these documents and their transmission to the public. This would have, however, made the organization a target for the Army, initiating a new and possibly more violent phase of conflict. It would need to be a very strong organization to survive without negotiating away its power. Perhaps, needless to say, whatever preparatory work had been done, such an organization would need to be almost entirely a product of the revolution itself, if it were to include its revolutionaries. Ifrey Byrne wants to attribute the failures of the mass protest decade to ideology, but does not investigate the material origins of this ideology. Yeah, there's so much on the left today that treats ideology as a sui generis material factor. And like I've said, it is kind of a mental technology, but they don't emerge on their own. They don't catch on just because somebody thought it. And it's definitely not just because the media says so. This is insulting and overplays the power of the media. And while Bevins is definitely critiquing the media, it is important to remember he's a creature of it. All right. It is true that the protesters in Turkey and Hong Kong chose to barricade the streets and fight the police rather than engage in strikes and boycotts, because that is what I saw happen in American mass culture. Bevins views protesters as unreasoning automatons mimicking what they see and hear. But was there no reasoning to these struggles, no intention, no imagination? Where did the tactics of occupying squares come from? Which movie is that? Ouch. Another line of analysis is the attempt to locate these tactics and the underlying material conditions which protesters face, attributing the lack of strikes to declining membership in unions. Cough, 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 and cough. Not just in the United States, it's everywhere, people. As well as the domestication of those unions by capital and the state. Gotta add that. Was this a choice or rather a matter of protesters availing themselves of the tactics and possibilities at hand, many of them as old as capitalism? If the comparative absence of working class parties and unions of the sort that could be expected to mediate revolutionary conflicts in the 20th century really the result of ideology alone, or does this ideology itself originate from the change in the character of the class struggle in late capitalism, resulting from an ongoing global reorganization of labor? So many people want models based on the factories, but the factories aren't coming back. And even if they do come back, they're not going to come back in the way they existed in the 1950s. And that's even true in the developing world. Bevins fails to understand this and also fails to understand why verticalist organizations failed so much in the 1960s and 70s, which led to the rebirth of ultra-left ideas that he's critiquing. Because he can't see that dialectic, and because he's not a historian, and because he's not entirely really representing all the sides of the story, you can see the problems. But this is an incredibly popular book because Great Leader Come Save Us is always fucking popular. It's also a sign of weakness. The left is very weak right now, and even the people calling it to refine its strength in these categories. And I'm not saying that leaderless movements are great. All of these movements have leaders, as the Free Fair movement actually indicates. But the idea that you need verticalism to fight horizontalism, it's a bad dialectic. Neither will work. I mean, fucking Rodrigo Nunes, whatever you think of the criticism of the book, is right about that. And it doesn't deal with the fact of why so many of these other forms went away. And until you deal with that fact in a real material sense, you're like the social democrats trying to find a resurgent labor movement because they see workers' militancy, even though it doesn't seem to be there in most cases. Or you're like the Marxist-Leninists, God bless them, who try to pretend that everything is 1917 forever and ever. And if we only had not changed paths after 1951 for whatever material conditions caused that, then none of the bad stuff of the second half of the 20th century, including the Sino-Soviet split, would have happened. Although, if we're going to pick sides on the side of the Soviet split, they often pick the wrong sides at the wrong time. What is to be done? I was writing a book that I was going to make about the millennial left, and then I realized myself that I did not fully understand how this could be integrated globally. That I could only really speak about America and the recurring patterns in America, even though I had existed and lived through some of these abroad. I was at Occupy Yoido because I was in South Korea. I saw some of the stuff in Oaxaca and the teachers' protest in that same square and occupation that has been kind of low-key going on in Oaxaca Square for a decade and a half, almost two at this point. I don't know how big it is today, but it was still pretty large when I was there in 2014 and 15. It's nice that Bernes recognizes that. I don't always agree with Bernes's answers. His communization theory often seems a little bit too teleological for me. However, I get his point here. Material conditions actually decide why a lot of these ideologies become what they are. And critiquing the ideology by themselves often misses that point. And if you don't get that, then you're going to have a hard time responding to situations on the ground. Protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment. You can tell me to fuck off if you like the Bevins book. I like parts of it. I think there's good reporting in there, but it's reporting. But it tries to draw historiographic conclusions from reporting. And I find that almost irresponsible. Protect your peace.